2 hours. That is how much time was left on the clock when the phone call that changed everything reportedly happened. 2 hours before a 50% tariff was scheduled to hit $20 billion worth of Canadian exports, an 11th hour escalation that had been building for exactly 1 month, ever since the president reached for legal authority so rarely used in modern American history that trade lawyers had to go digging through decades-old case files just to understand its actual limits, a level of legal obscurity that itself became a minor story within the larger story, as reporters and analysts scrambled to explain to their audiences a legal mechanism almost nobody had needed to think about in generations. And then, at 10:15 at night, with almost no warning, it stopped. A short post, a 3-day pause, and a sentence that immediately raised more questions than it answered. Canada and the United States, subject to finalization of documents, have a deal. What deal? Negotiated by whom? Covering what, exactly? 12 hours later, officials in Ottawa still could not give reporters a straight answer, and 18 hours after that, the President of the United States himself gave an answer so vague, standing on the White House lawn, that it somehow made the entire situation less clear, rather than more, a genuinely unusual dynamic for a story the administration itself was actively promoting as a major diplomatic win. This is the story of how a fight over automobiles nearly triggered one of the largest single tariff escalations between these two countries in years, and how it appears to have been defused in the final hours through a deal that, as of right now, almost nobody outside a small circle of negotiators has actually seen in writing. It is a story worth understanding properly, because the automotive relationship between these two countries is genuinely unlike almost any other bilateral trade relationship on Earth, built over decades into something closer to a single integrated production zone than two entirely separate national industries competing against one another. It is worth understanding exactly what kind of legal ground the administration was standing on when it made this threat, because it changes how seriously the entire episode should be read. Section 232, the authority behind the original 25% car tariff, is a national security provision, one that requires a formal government determination that a category of imports threatens the country's security, a legal justification used in recent years to cover steel, aluminum, semiconductors, and now automobiles. The newer 50% threat relied on something else entirely, a provision dating back to 1930 that has essentially never been used this way in the modern era of American trade policy, one that lets the president impose duties without that same national security determination, based instead on a finding of discriminatory treatment against American commerce. That distinction matters because it meant nobody involved, not the negotiators, not outside legal experts, not even the administration's own lawyers, could say with total confidence how such tariffs would hold up if formally challenged in court, adding an extra layer of legal uncertainty on top of the economic uncertainty already hanging over these talks. Let's establish exactly what we know, because a story moving this fast deserves precision rather than assumption, and precision is exactly what tends to disappear first once a story like this one starts circulating widely online, stripped of nuance and reduced to a single triumphant headline. 1 month before that late-night phone call on the 20th of July, the administration signed a set of proclamations invoking an authority buried in a 1930 trade law, a provision that allows tariffs of up to 50% on a country found to be discriminating against American commerce. It is worth pausing on that detail alone, because this specific legal tool has essentially never been used this way in the modern era, and legal experts who tracked trade policy described it at the time as genuinely uncharted territory, a power so rarely invoked that nobody could say with confidence how it would hold up if challenged in court. The administration pointed to Canada's treatment of American automakers, dairy producers, and alcohol producers as justification, and it set a deadline exactly 30 days out. If no deal was reached, tariffs would jump to 50% on a carefully targeted list of Canadian goods worth roughly $20 billion, hitting everything from cement to hockey sticks. And for nearly the entire month that followed, the single biggest obstacle standing in the way of any resolution was not dairy, and it was not alcohol. It was cars. Think for a moment about the precision behind that $20 billion figure, because it was not chosen at random. It represented roughly 5% of everything Canada exports to the United States annually, deliberately concentrated in categories the administration believed would apply maximum political and economic pressure without triggering the kind of sweeping disruption a tariff on Canada's entire export relationship would cause. Hockey sticks, tongue depressors, cement, alcohol, dairy, and automobiles. By a wide margin, the largest and most economically significant category on the entire list. This was a scalpel, not a blunt instrument, aimed precisely at industries Canadian officials themselves would find politically painful to absorb. And for the better part of a month, it appeared to be working exactly as designed, right up until the final hours before it was scheduled to take effect. By the time you finish watching this, you're going to understand exactly why a technical dispute over how to calculate tariff exemptions on automobiles nearly triggered a full-blown trade confrontation between two of the closest allies on the planet, why a long-dead pipeline project suddenly reappeared in the middle of these negotiations, why officials in Ottawa, even after the president publicly declared victory, were still refusing to use the word deal themselves, and why the specific accounting formula buried inside this agreement matters more to the future of North American manufacturing than the headline tariff percentage everyone has been focused on. This is a story with far more moving parts than the headlines suggest, and untangling it properly is going to take a little time, so stay with me, because the details buried underneath the celebratory tone coming out of Washington this week matter just as much as the headline itself, if not considerably more. If you find value in coverage that actually separates what has been confirmed from what officials are still spinning, especially on a story this fluid, consider subscribing, because deals negotiated this close to a deadline have a well-documented habit of changing again before the ink is even dry. And this particular deal, spanning cars, dairy, alcohol, and energy all at once, has more moving parts than almost any single trade negotiation either country has conducted in years. To understand why cars specifically became the flashpoint in this fight, you need to understand a tariff structure that has been quietly reshaping the North American auto industry for more than a year already. Roughly 18 months ago, the administration imposed a 25% tariff under a separate national security authority known as Section 232 on foreign-built cars and trucks entering the United States. For vehicles assembled in Canada, that tariff applied only to the portion of a vehicle's value considered non-American content, an attempt to push manufacturers towards sourcing more components domestically. Canada responded in kind, imposing its own 25% tariff on American-built vehicles that did not comply with the existing Continental Trade Agreement, a measure expected to generate roughly 8 billion Canadian dollars, which the government pledged to redirect to workers and companies hurt by the American tariffs. That standoff sat there, mostly unresolved, for well over a year, an expensive stalemate that officials on both sides publicly admitted was hurting factories and workers, but neither side seemed willing to move first, each waiting for some external pressure to finally force the other's hand. This month, under the pressure of the newly imposed 50% deadline that finally changed, and the shape of the emerging compromise reveals exactly why this negotiation proved so difficult, since it required both governments to resolve, within a matter of weeks, a dispute that had already resisted resolution for well over a year of prior, lower-stakes discussions. According to multiple people familiar with the talks, the proposal on the table would cut the auto tariff from 25% down to a baseline of 15%. That reduction alone would matter enormously to an industry operating on thin margins. But the real fight was over something far more technical and far more consequential once you understand the mechanics behind it. The dispute centered on how to calculate content deductions, the formula that determines how much of a given vehicle's value gets exempted from the tariff in the first place. American negotiators wanted credit only for parts specifically made in the United States. Canadian negotiators wanted credit for any content sourced anywhere within the broader North American trade zone, meaning Canadian and Mexican components would count right alongside American ones. That distinction sounds like a minor accounting detail, and it is anything but. Modern vehicles assembled in this region are built from components that cross the Canadian, American, and Mexican borders multiple times before a finished car ever reaches a dealership. Under the broader formula Canada was pushing for, a vehicle with 70% North American content could see its effective tariff rate fall well below the headline 15% figure, potentially into the single digits. Under the narrower American formula, that same vehicle might barely qualify for any meaningful discount at all. In an industry where margins are measured in single percentage points, that is not an academic disagreement. It is the difference between a plant staying open and a plant shutting its doors, a distinction that matters enormously to the tens of thousands of workers whose jobs sit downstream of a single formula. Most of them will never actually read in full, buried inside legal text that rarely makes it into any news broadcast. According to reporting from multiple outlets tracking these talks in real time, Canada pushed for a rate as low as 10%, or alternatively, a broader carve-out for American parts content inside Canadian-built vehicles, a negotiating position that reflected just how much weight Canadian officials placed on the automotive file relative to every other issue on the table. The administration, according to people familiar with the negotiations, held firm at a minimum of 15%. That specific impasse is what kept negotiators deadlocked right up until the final 36 hours before the deadline, according to reporting published earlier in the week before the late-night breakthrough changed the entire tone of the story, catching even seasoned trade watchers off guard by how quickly the mood shifted from confrontation to conciliation. Here is where things take a genuinely unexpected turn, Because what emerged from that late-night phone call was not simply a revised tariff number, and understanding why requires stepping back to look at the full scope of what appears to have been discussed, rather than fixating narrowly on the automotive percentage that dominated headlines throughout the preceding month. It was a far broader package, one that appears to reach well beyond automobiles into energy policy, agricultural trade, and even provincial alcohol regulations that have almost nothing to do with cars on the surface. In the social media post announcing the pause, the president made a passing reference to Keystone XL, the long-dormant pipeline project designed to carry crude oil from Alberta down through the American Midwest to Gulf Coast refineries. That project carries one of the most politically charged histories of any piece of energy infrastructure in North America. First proposed back in 2008, rejected once, revived once, and ultimately killed off permanently in 2021 when the incoming administration canceled its cross-border permit on its very first day in office. The post referred to the pipeline as potentially being awoken from the grave, accompanied by an artificially generated image of the president pulling a section of pipe directly out of the ground. He did not explicitly confirm the pipeline was formally part of any trade agreement, and the White House did not provide further clarification when asked. But the timing was impossible to ignore, and it fits a broader pattern. Since the administration had already approved a smaller related pipeline project earlier this year, when some observers had already started nicknaming Keystone Light, designed to move a smaller volume of Canadian crude through Montana and Wyoming. It is worth pausing on the Keystone reference a little longer, because for anyone who has not followed North American energy politics closely, the weight of that single line is easy to miss entirely. The pipeline was designed to carry as much as 830,000 barrels of crude oil per day from Alberta's oil sands down to refineries along the Gulf Coast, one of the largest single pieces of cross-border energy infrastructure ever proposed between the two countries. It became, over more than a decade, one of the most politically charged environmental and economic fights in either nation, rejected once, revived once, and finally killed permanently when the incoming administration canceled its cross-border permit on its first day in office back in 2021, a decision that infuriated the Canadian energy sector and became, for supporters of the project, a lasting symbol of missed economic opportunity. Reviving it now, even as a gesture inside a broader trade negotiation, would represent a meaningful political reversal, and the company behind the original project, now operating under different ownership than when it was first proposed, would need to reassess the entire venture from scratch before any construction could realistically resume, since pipeline projects of this scale typically require years of permitting and environmental review, even under the most politically favorable conditions imaginable. The following morning, speaking to reporters while touring construction work on the White House lawn, a notably informal setting for an announcement of this magnitude, the president described the emerging agreement as a very fair deal for both countries. He claimed Canadian tariffs would become, in his words, non-existent for American farmers, without specifying exactly which duties he meant. He said Canada had called the previous day, and in his account, given the administration the points it had insisted on throughout the negotiation. But when a reporter pressed him directly on whether the United States would actually lower tariffs on Canadian-built automobiles, the single issue that had dominated Ottawa's negotiating priorities from the very beginning, his answer was strikingly vague. "We're doing certain things," he said. "We've got to give something. They were paying a high number. We're reducing it a little bit. It's good for everybody." Listen to that phrasing carefully. That is not the language of a signed, detailed, finalized agreement. That is the language of a broad political understanding, still waiting to be translated into an actual legal document, with actual percentages, actual effective dates, and actual enforcement language, all of which officials on both sides openly acknowledged were still being finalized at the time those comments were made. On the Canadian side, the tone told an entirely different story, and that contrast itself is worth sitting with for a moment. It is a contrast that has repeated itself in one form or another across nearly every major round of trade diplomacy between these two countries over the past several years, where an initial burst of optimistic headlines out of Washington is often followed weeks or months later by a far more complicated and less flattering account of what was actually agreed to once the fine print becomes public. Prime Minister Mark Carney never once used the word deal in his own public remarks. He spoke instead of substantial progress having been made, while explicitly cautioning that important work remained before anything could be considered final. Canada's trade minister and its chief negotiator spent the following days shuttling between Ottawa and Washington, briefing provincial and territorial leaders on a call, working through what one trade lawyer close to the process described as putting finishing touches on Canada's side of the agreement, while stopping well short of guaranteeing the deal would actually come together by the newly extended deadline. When the head of government celebrating a win refuses to say the word deal, and the government supposedly conceding refuses to confirm the terms either, That gap tells you something important about how much genuinely remains unsettled behind closed doors. And it is precisely the kind of discrepancy a careful viewer should learn to notice, since it often reveals far more about the true state of a negotiation than either side's official talking points ever will. It helps to understand exactly why Canada's dairy supply management system has proven so resistant to outside pressure across decades of prior negotiations, because it sits at the intersection of economics and domestic politics in a way that makes it uniquely difficult to touch. Under that system, Canadian dairy farmers operate within a tightly controlled quota structure, with production levels set to match domestic demand and steep tariffs applied to any imports beyond a narrow quota threshold, a structure Canadian officials have long defended as essential to protecting small and mid-sized family dairy operations from being undercut by heavily subsidized American production. American negotiators, across multiple administrations and multiple rounds of trade talks stretching back years, have consistently identified the system as one of the most significant remaining barriers facing American agricultural exporters, and it survived essentially unchanged through the last major renegotiation of the region's trade framework, despite intense pressure at the time. Any genuine movement on this file now would represent a considerably larger concession than anything achieved in previous rounds, which is exactly why Canadian dairy groups were watching this particular week with unusually close attention. What makes this story genuinely surprising is just how far Canada appeared willing to move across multiple, seemingly unrelated fronts all at once in order to secure a deal that still only reduced, rather than eliminated, the tariff burden on its largest manufacturing sector. According to multiple reports tracking the negotiations, the American side pushed for Canada to drop its retaliatory auto tariffs entirely, to revisit how licenses are allocated under its decades-old dairy supply management system, one that survived essentially unchanged through the last major renegotiation of the region's entire trade framework, and to instruct provincial liquor boards, which control the vast majority of alcohol retail across the country, to return American beer, wine, and spirits to store shelves after a boycott Canadian officials themselves described as devastatingly effective at suppressing American alcohol sales. The Premier of Nova Scotia confirmed he had been personally asked by the Prime Minister's office to begin restocking American products, while candidly acknowledging that getting Canadians to actually buy them again after months of a coordinated boycott campaign was, in his own words, an entirely separate challenge. It is worth asking directly why Canada, a country that had spent the better part of the past year and a half building an entire political posture around standing firm against American economic pressure, would appear willing to concede this much ground on so many fronts simultaneously. Part of the answer lies in the sheer economic weight riding on the outcome of the automotive dispute specifically. Automotive manufacturing is one of Canada's largest employers, heavily concentrated in Ontario and inseparably woven into American supply chains built up over more than 3 decades. Assembly plants on either side of the border do not simply compete with one another, they depend on each other, with individual components crossing back and forth across the border multiple times over the course of a single vehicle's production. For assembly line workers living through this dispute in real time, in Windsor, just as much as in Detroit, the stakes were never abstract policy questions. They were shift schedules, overtime hours, and, in the more severe scenarios discussed by industry analysts, the long-term survival of entire plants, since automakers facing sustained tariff pressure routinely shift production volume toward whichever facility offers the most favorable cost structure at a given moment, decisions made far from any factory floor but felt immediately on it. It is also worth understanding just how deeply the alcohol dispute cut into everyday commerce on both sides of the border, since it illustrates how a fight that began over cars and steel expanded into territory touching ordinary consumer habits in ways few would have predicted at the outset. Provincial liquor boards, which control the overwhelming majority of alcohol retail across Canada, pulled American products from their shelves in a coordinated act of retaliation, removing well-known American beer, wine, and spirit brands from stores nationwide almost overnight. Canadian officials themselves described the resulting drop in American alcohol sales as devastatingly effective, a rare admission of just how much leverage a seemingly symbolic consumer boycott can generate when backed by the purchasing power of an entire national retail system. Reversing that boycott does not guarantee sales actually recover, since consumer habits formed during a boycott often outlast the political dispute that triggered them in the first place. A lesson retailers on both sides of the border have learned the hard way during past trade disputes as well. There is a domestic political dimension worth mentioning too, since it will shape how any final agreement actually gets received once the fine print becomes public. Canada's opposition Conservative leader, while relieved a broader trade confrontation appeared to have been averted, was openly skeptical of the terms being described, arguing that anything short of an outright better deal than existed before this entire saga began would represent a failure against the government's own previously stated benchmarks. The president of Unifor, the union representing a large share of Canada's auto sector workforce, struck a similarly cautious tone, noting plainly that the devil is going to be in the details of whatever eventually gets signed. Both reactions point to the same underlying truth. A celebratory announcement, even when delivered through a viral social media post, is not the same thing as a ratified, legally binding agreement that either government or either industry can actually plan around with confidence. A distinction that matters enormously to the automakers, suppliers, and workers whose livelihoods depend on knowing exactly what the rules will be for years into the future, not just for the next 3 days, and whose long-term hiring and investment plans cannot responsibly be built around a social media post, no matter how confident its tone. It helps to place this dispute inside a longer-running historical pattern, because automobiles have been the flashpoint in North American trade disputes before, and understanding that history explains why this particular fight proved so genuinely difficult to resolve. It helps to place this dispute inside a longer-running historical pattern, because automobiles have been the flashpoint in North American trade disputes before, and understanding that history explains why this particular fight proved so genuinely difficult to resolve. Go back further still, and this is far from the first time an American administration has reached for aggressive tariff authority against a close trading partner over automobiles specifically. In the 1980s, mounting political pressure over Japanese auto imports led to a negotiated system of voluntary export restraints, an arrangement where Japan agreed to limit the number of vehicles it shipped to the United States each year, a solution that avoided a formal tariff confrontation, but reshaped the American auto industry for a generation, encouraging Japanese manufacturers to begin building plants directly inside the United States, rather than exporting finished vehicles from overseas. That historical episode offers a useful lesson for understanding this current dispute. Trade pressure applied to the automotive sector specifically tends to produce structural changes that outlast the political moment that triggered them, reshaping where and how vehicles actually get built for years, sometimes decades, after the original headlines fade. The underlying trade framework governing this entire relationship was itself born out of a similarly fraught renegotiation roughly a decade ago, one that dragged on for well over a year, nearly collapsed on multiple separate occasions, and ultimately produced an agreement spanning 32 chapters, including an entire section devoted specifically to new rules governing how much of a vehicle's content had to originate within North America, and how much had to be produced by workers earning above a specified wage floor, a provision aimed directly at discouraging manufacturers from shifting production toward lower wage regions. That underlying agreement was always scheduled for a formal joint review by all 3 member countries around the middle of this year, a built-in checkpoint that added its own layer of pressure and uncertainty to an already tense environment, since any party dissatisfied with how that review unfolds could theoretically reopen far more of the relationship than automotive tariffs alone. Now consider what all of this actually means in dollars and cents for people who have never given a single thought to a tariff formula in their entire lives. There's also a currency and investment dimension to this story worth understanding, one that extends well beyond the sticker price of a single vehicle, touching decisions made in corporate boardrooms long before any individual car ever gets built. Automakers deciding where to locate new production capacity, whether to build the next generation of a popular model in Ontario, Michigan, or somewhere else entirely, factor tariff exposure directly into those long-term investment decisions, sometimes years before a single vehicle actually reaches a dealership lot. A stable, predictable tariff formula, even one that still involves some cost, tends to be more attractive to corporate planners than a lower headline number attached to genuine ongoing uncertainty about how it might change again in a year or two. That is part of why the finalized legal text of this agreement matters so much more than the celebratory announcement that preceded it, since automakers making billion-dollar capital allocation decisions need durable clarity, not a social media post. Picture a mid-sized sedan assembled in Ontario, built from a mix of Canadian, American, and Mexican components sourced across this deeply integrated regional supply chain. Under the current 25% tariff, applied only to non-American content, several major automakers have already publicly acknowledged either raising prices or absorbing thinner margins over the past year, rather than passing the full cost onto buyers all at once. Under a reduced 15% baseline combined with the broader North American content formula Canada has been pushing for, that same vehicle's effective tariff exposure could fall dramatically, potentially freeing automakers to lower prices, expand production, or simply restore margins that have been under sustained pressure since the original tariff took effect. If, instead, negotiators land on the narrower American preferred formula, the practical benefit could end up considerably smaller than the 15% headline number implies, since so much of what Canadian plants build relies on components sourced from Mexico as well as the United States, a reality that underscores just how misleading a single headline percentage can be without the underlying formula attached to it. That is exactly why this seemingly dry accounting dispute carried so much weight throughout these talks. Reportedly more than any other single issue on the table, dairy, alcohol, or even the 50% threat itself, a hierarchy of priorities that says a great deal about where the true economic weight of this entire relationship actually sits, once you look past the more politically charged headline categories. It also helps to remember what this dispute looked like from the perspective of the people actually building these vehicles, rather than only the executives and negotiators whose statements dominate coverage of a story like this one. Assembly line workers on both sides of the border spent the past year and a half living with genuine uncertainty about shift schedules and overtime hours, watching automakers respond to tariff pressure by quietly shifting production volume between plants in different countries depending on which facility offered the most favorable cost structure at a given moment. That kind of production shifting rarely makes headlines the way a presidential tariff announcement does, but it represents one of the most direct, tangible ways this entire dispute touched real households, long before any resolution was ever announced. There is also a wider set of stakes here too, extending well beyond cars specifically. The same negotiating window that produced this emerging framework also appears to have opened the door to movement on steel and aluminum tariffs, currently sitting at 50%, the highest rate applied to any category in this entire trade relationship, with its own separate history tracing back to an earlier round of national security tariffs imposed years before this current auto dispute even began. That 50% metals tariff has remained a persistent irritant even during periods when other parts of the relationship were relatively calm, a separate grievance running on its own parallel track for years. According to a source familiar with a private meeting between the two leaders, material progress was reportedly made on steel and aluminum during the same conversations that produced the auto framework, raising the possibility that whatever final package emerges could end up addressing a considerably wider swath of the relationship than most observers expected walking into this particular deadline. Canadian officials heading into that meeting had specifically hoped for relief on the metal sector, and while nothing concrete has been confirmed publicly, the fact that it came up at all during talks primarily focused on automobiles suggests both governments may be treating this entire round as an opportunity to clear multiple outstanding disputes at once, rather than addressing them one at a time across separate future negotiating rounds spread out over additional months or years. There is also a structural pressure point sitting just beyond this immediate deadline worth flagging, since the entire trade framework governing this relationship is already scheduled for that formal three-country review, meaning whatever bilateral arrangement gets finalized this week may end up functioning more as a temporary bridge than a permanent settlement, a detail that has gotten far less attention than it deserves amid the drama of the past several days. That review process itself carries its own significant uncertainty, since Mexico, the third partner in this trade relationship, has its own separate set of grievances and priorities that could complicate any attempt to simply extend a bilateral Canada-United States understanding into a broader three-country framework. Trade negotiations involving three separate governments, each answering to their own domestic political pressures, tend to move considerably slower and produce considerably messier outcomes than negotiations between just two parties, a dynamic worth keeping in mind as this story continues to develop over the coming months, well beyond whatever gets finalized in the next few days, specifically between Washington and Ottawa. None of this means the broader relationship between these two countries is suddenly, cleanly resolved, and it would be irresponsible to suggest otherwise at this early stage. It is also worth remembering that Canada and the United States have navigated periods of serious trade friction before without it derailing the broader relationship permanently, a track record that offers some genuine reason for cautious optimism, even amid all the remaining uncertainty. Agreements this complex, assembled under the pressure of an imminent deadline and touching everything from automotive content formulas to provincial liquor policy to a resurrected pipeline project, tend to reveal their true complications only after the initial headlines fade and lawyers on both sides begin working through the actual legal text line by line. History offers a useful reminder here. Since the last time these two countries, together with Mexico, renegotiated their entire trade relationship from scratch, the process dragged on for well over a year beyond initial expectations and nearly collapsed more than once, even after ceremonial signing had already taken place. There is no guarantee this round moves any faster, particularly with this many separate, technically complicated issues seemingly bundled together under significant time pressure. So watch for three specific things in the days directly ahead, and consider setting aside the celebratory framing coming out of Washington in favor of watching what actually gets published in writing, since a public relations victory and a legally binding trade agreement are simply not the same thing, no matter how confidently one side describes the other. Whether the two governments actually meet the newly extended deadline, or quietly announce yet another short extension, which would itself signal deeper unresolved disagreement than this week's celebratory tone suggested. Whether the final content deduction formula lands closer to the narrower American version or the broader Canadian version, since that single technical detail will determine whether this deal genuinely transforms the economics of North American auto manufacturing or simply softens the edges of an existing dispute. And whether the additional pieces mentioned in passing this week, the pipeline, the steel and aluminum relief, the dairy system changes, actually show up in a final signed text or quietly disappear, the way ambitious trade promises sometimes do once immediate deadline pressure has passed. Whatever the final numbers turn out to be, they will not stay contained inside a press release or a late-night social media post. They will show up in the price of a new truck on a dealership lot in Michigan, in the paycheck of an assembly line worker in Ontario, and in a trade relationship that two of the closest allies on the planet are still, even now, in the middle of figuring out how to rebuild, one phone call, one accounting formula, and one late-night announcement at a time. That rebuilding process, whatever shape it ultimately takes, will likely continue well past whatever gets signed in the coming days, since trade relationships this deeply integrated do not get fully repaired through a single agreement, no matter how significant that agreement turns out to be on paper. What began as a narrow dispute over how to calculate content deductions on an assembly line has, over the course of a single month, expanded into a wide-ranging conversation touching energy infrastructure, agricultural policy, and provincial retail regulations. A reminder of just how interconnected these two economies actually are beneath the surface of any single headline. And that interconnection cuts both ways. It is exactly why a prolonged trade confrontation would have been genuinely costly for both countries, and exactly why both governments, despite weeks of tough public rhetoric, ultimately found enough common ground to step back from the 50% tariff deadline in the final hours before it took effect. A last-minute reversal that surprised even some officials closely involved in the negotiations themselves. Whether that same common ground proves durable enough to survive the coming three-country review process, the coming months of legal drafting, and the inevitable political scrutiny still to come on both sides of the border, remains, as of this recording, the single biggest open question hanging over this entire story.